Okay. Okay. I can't be the only one. It must not be, because I see a lot of people talking about how there's a radio station just constantly playing Killing in the Name of. I think it's fantastic. All right, here comes Christine. Hey, Christine.
CarrieLynn, how are you doing?
Boy, is that a loaded question these days or what? I'm okay. How are you?
Probably about the same. Yeah.
All right, here comes Leetal. I am sharing things out. Oops, that's what I want. Hey, Leetal, how you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
We were both just discussing that question, but I'm okay. I can say I'm okay. All right.
That doesn't sound great.
Well, no. I was just watching videos on TikTok of young people talking about, if you're planning to protest this July 4th weekend in the United States, here's what you need to do to be as safe as possible. And I'm like, it makes me think that if we had TikTok like in World War II or something, you would have had people talking about, okay, well, this is what you have to do when you get over on the front to not so quickly die, or something like that. I'm like, it's crazy. It's not crazy. It's horrible. But I think we're here to talk about an interesting topic, and it is the last day of Pride. So I want to thank you both for coming in and being willing to talk about this. And I don't know if anyone else is coming, so I figure we can just get started with the three of us.
Sounds good.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a popular culture dialogue today. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus, and that's totally my fault because I've been way too busy. But hopefully we're able to get back in the monthly swing of things now. This day, because it is June 30th, 2022, when we're recording this and streaming it, it is the last day of Pride Month. So given that and the decision that just happened in the United States Supreme Court that could have significant ramifications, not just for women in overall, but for the entire LGBTQIA plus community, I thought it might be a good time to have a conversation about the relationship between that community and popular culture. So before we really get into, someone says morning from our YouTube chat, morning. Before we really get into the topic, of course, I would love for both of you to introduce yourself. And I know you are repeat guests here, so I thank you for that. But yeah, just again, tell us a little bit about what brings you here today. So Christine, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yeah, hello, I'm Christine. I'm a lecturer at the University of California, Irvine in the School of Social Sciences and a game studies specialist with the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University. I do a lot of work on like online spaces and broad popular culture, but for the most part, a lot of my research focus and teaching focus is on video games and representation therein. So excited to have a conversation today about LGBTQIA issues, topics, and futures in pop culture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. And we'll go down to Dean.
Hey, so I really, really love this series, and I'm so thank you for having me again. Absolutely. So I'm a grad student. I study transgender, non-binary stuff mostly. And well, I'm almost every letter in the LGBTQ plus. Almost.
Awesome. And I'm grateful to have you both here. And I know, Dean, you also are coming from outside of the United States. You're providing an extra perspective on this overall issue as well. So that's wonderful. So thank you for being here. All right, kind of where I was thinking of getting started is there's been a lot of research and talk, of course, about, the history of popular culture and LGBTQ representation. We could talk about representation today. We could talk about fans today, and there's so much to talk about. But I kind of want to jump in at a particular angle, maybe to start this conversation. And it comes from having recently seen the most recent Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which bad movie, but I won't go into that. One thing I found interesting in that movie was that they introduced the character of America Chavez, who is from the comic books and is queer in the comic books, especially because she has two mothers in the universe that she originally comes from. So in this movie, they maintained the two mothers, which I thought was fantastic. And they also, I don't know if it was throughout the movie, but I know at one point, America Chavez was wearing the pride flag as a pin on the jacket she wears. And the movie doesn't really comment much on either of those things. They're just there. In a way, they're almost presented as normal, as natural, because no one's calling them out and no one is highlighting them either in terms of in a derogatory way or in a celebratory way. So it feels like it's been normalized in some way. And I kind of want to just get your sense from both of you as to where we are now in American popular culture or global popular culture, however you want to address it, but where we're at in terms of that normalization and that naturalization, so that it's not something that we have to highlight. It just is. And that actually is a positive. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that first, especially given what might be coming to this community, given United States culture at this point. Dean?
Can I go first?
You go for it.
Thanks. So I haven't watched a movie. Thanks for the warning. For me, I mean, for me, it's not addressing it is kind of in the middle when it comes to good and bad representation. It's better than some things they could have done, but it's not very good representation when it comes to very good representation. It's because there are a lot of the liberal notion that, you know, women are just like men and queer people are just like straight people and all of that. I mean, it's better than kill everybody, but it doesn't really give a lot of space for, no, we're not. We are different. We have specific, or some of us have specific issues, needs, interests, and those deserve to be discussed, even in Marvel, you know?
And that's a good point, because the movie, she comes from a different universe. So she doesn't have to perhaps address the idea of being from, normal universe, which may have pretty significant issues when it comes to being raised by two mothers. I mean, the universe that she appears to come from is this weird, completely CGI, but this weird pastoral Garden of Eden looking place in some ways, which is kind of fascinating. Christine?
Yeah, I actually there were a couple of shows that kind of dealt with coming out stories that I watched semi recently that I wanted to talk about in this context. So I'm excited that we're starting at this point. I'm going to try to be polite about my assessment of the situation with Doctor Strange. I haven't seen the movie yet, but I mean, when you're dealing with that company and franchise in particular, I think that that's the loudest statement they're sort of financially allowed to make, which is something to consider. I mean, they've been doing small things, but those small things have been a big deal for the context that they're working in, especially since there are so many concerns about, international market and being able to tap into a lot of other contexts where, this could be a much bigger deal than in the US, for example. But I did want to highlight a couple of things. So Umbrella Academy and Our Flag Means Death, which it should be no surprise to anyone that I'm going to talk about, at least the second show there. But they both dealt with sort of coming out stories. And I don't want to spoil anything in either of those, so I'll be kind of vague about it. But for Umbrella Academy, it was very much did we lose Dean? Uh-oh.
It's okay. She sometimes has internet issues.
Okay. But for Umbrella Academy, it was very much like an acknowledging that there is this big change happening and people are needing to process it and sort of deal with it and have it explained to them that now there is this transgender identity being introduced into the group dynamic. Our Flag Means Death, on the other hand, just rolled with it. There was never actually a coming out. Everyone just immediately switched to they, them pronouns for this particular character. And I thought that was actually a much better way to deal with it, because it's still very explicit. You're using these pronouns. You're sort of organically accepting who this person is and what their identity is. Whereas I think Umbrella Academy was happening at a different cultural moment and sort of acknowledging the culture that actually exists and the framework that people are working with in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases still. But I think that Our Flag Means Death approach is a little bit better, because it's sort of pulling us forward instead of keeping us stuck in that cultural moment where things are tense and people are confused, if that makes sense. It's also 7 a.m, so sorry if I'm like rambling.
That's all right. But I think this political economic aspect is important to think about too, because like with Our Flag Means Death, I believe that was the plan, like from the beginning, for this character to be portrayed this way. But then you think about Umbrella Academy, and it was the actor and the change in their life that then fostered, or in some way, I wouldn't say required, but definitely influenced the subsequent text as well. So it was almost like, because Umbrella Academy had that built-in fan base already, they might have felt the need to over-explain things to that fan base.
Yeah, which makes sense, especially if you're trying to say, okay, well, how do we get the fans on board with this? But it was interesting, because a lot of fans, after Elliot Page came out, a lot of fans were like, oh, okay, how is the show going to deal with this? How are they going to write it in? And that was like kind of a talking point and thinking point for a lot of the fan base.
Yeah. So it is, on the one hand, we have interesting attempts, and I think we're seeing a range of different approaches to try to present LGBTQ issues and storylines and characters in a positive way overall, whether it is, explaining things or just integrating into the story or kind of almost having it as a background so that it seems normal or naturalized. Have you, either of you, seen any of what you would consider to be more of a negative portrayal at this point? I know I intentionally don't circulate in where I think those might be occurring because I only have so much emotional energy at this point. But do we still see that circulating to the extent that we might have seen in the 1980s, I think in particular, beforehand?
Should I hop in first?
Sure.
It's an interesting question because it's definitely still out there. And I can't even remember what the movie was, but I recently watched a horror movie that I couldn't believe was made in 2018. Because it was just effectively like it was just trans people bad. That was the entire horror part of that movie. And also, like, the issues with mental health and all of these things. It was just very much anything that you can think of that has been stigmatized in the last many decades was just on display in this film, which was shocking to me because the landscape for media has changed pretty significantly. So there is that, and you do still have a lot of, you have queer baiting, which has happened in a lot of cases still, which is something that fans aren't particularly fond of. I think one of the last times that I had one of these conversations with you, we talked a little bit about Supernatural and queer baiting in that show. And then, I just recently talked about a couple of video games for a conference where they were very subtly presenting certain identities, or they present identities in kind of subtle ways. If you're not playing a certain way, you aren't going to find out that this character is bisexual, for example. Which is a little bit messy and a little bit concerning as well. But they have in one game in particular, I guess I'll say Dragon Age Inquisition, they had effectively an asexual aromantic character who a lot of people were excited about. You don't see this kind of thing in video games, especially in media more broadly. You don't really see a lot of ace characters. And then in an add-on for the video game, they give that character a girlfriend and completely erase all of that. So I think that the relationship between representation of LGBTQIA identities and media is still tense. It's definitely not perfect. You still have people stumbling over these things. But I think that the outright, like, offensive, these identities are bad representations are far and fewer between than certainly in the 1980s and even in the 1990s.
It's less on the stereotypes and maybe more on the not discussing it, as Dean, I think you were saying before.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's the 80s and 90s were really rough when it comes to, bury your gays, especially for transgender people and marginalized transgender people. And that definitely still exists, but not as widely as it used to. But I was thinking, just as you were saying, I'm playing Love Island, the game. And which is, I love it, but it's a game that came as part of the franchise of the show, but it's just a game. And they have a non-binary character, which I find incredibly exciting. The show hasn't done anything like that, but that character basically is, they say the boys and the girls. So that character is a boy for the whole thing and uses he, him, and doesn't mention being non-binary. And it's been released weekly over a few months. So in one of the last weeks, they mentioned that they also use they pronouns, but it's okay because they're feeling kind of he these days, and that's what we get at the end. And it's just a little, and that's really, really common on television as well. There are so many shows that have a non-binary character that literally has one line or appears, you know, in the background for a moment or in one episode, or they have a lot of characters. I'm writing about Good Omens right now, which I absolutely love it, okay? But we know that Crowley and Aziraphale are non-binary, and Ace Arrow, if I'm not mistaken, because Neil Gaiman told us outside of the show. There are a lot of queer vibes on the show, but the random person who is not non-binary or doesn't follow Neil Gaiman on Twitter wouldn't know it and wouldn't be educated by it, wouldn't think the next time they meet a person who's non-binary, wouldn't like use that knowledge of what being non-binary might be like because of those characters, at least based on what we've seen so far.
And in some ways, I think Good Omens kind of gets at that queer baiting as well, too, and always walking the line, but, you know, never really committing. Christine?
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to like dive into video games too much, but like Love Island and I also enjoy it. And like I might talk a little bit about another online, there's like sort of a mobile game that's it looks like a dating app. It's called Love Link, but I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the other things, like if we're thinking about something like Good Omens or even Hannibal, and I know I talk about these every time that I'm on here as well, but if we think about shows like that, there's also something interesting going on with audience readings and audience dynamics, because you have a lot of situations where, like, I guess it's the flip side of people trying to read queer subtext into something, where you have non-queer people who are consuming something that has like very clear queer messaging, but they like it's not as in your face as it could be. Like they're not, you know, engaging in direct relationships or using specific pronouns, and so a lot of it's just sort of hinted at. And it's a lost on a lot of the audience. Like I've read so many online conversations of people not realizing that Good Omens or Hannibal are love stories and being upset when people mention that they are. And Hannibal problematic for a lot of reasons, but you know, still very, very popular for that kind of messaging. With that in mind, like Love Island is such an interesting case too, because they allow you to engage in like same-sex romances, but to the most truncated possible point. Like you barely get to explore it. It's kind of an afterthought option at the very end of a lot of the seasons. I haven't played the latest season, so I don't know exactly what's going on there, but in the past ones. And then you have games like Love Link, which are interesting in another way, where you have a lot of queer representation in that game. And as the player, you're kind of forced into being non-binary. They're moving in a different direction with that a little bit slowly, but that's the first time that I've seen that imposed on a player, which has been very interesting. You do have non-binary characters. You have characters that present themselves with an array of gender expressions and gender identities, and sort of romantic proclivities. And it's sort of interesting because even that has like a weird effect on audiences, where you have queer players who express that they're upset because now they're in this non-binary role, and a lot of the romances are written in very specific ways. And they feel pigeonholed, like they can't express their physical world queer identity as part of this game experience. And so it's a very unique problem that players experience with that end of representation as well.
In thinking about video games, I just want to bring up one. I want to see if either of you have played it or heard of it. It's called Story of Seasons, Pioneers of Olive Town. And I picked it up because I love these farming games that I just think they're fun. And I thought it was fascinating how you essentially, as your character is very gendered, it's, you know, man or woman, and it's he or she. But all of the eligible love interests, you could be going after men, you could be going after women, and basically they have very similar reactions to you. There's no real sense of any queering of the characters. It's just like, oh, hey, we love each other. It's almost like it's very demisexual in some ways without being very explicit about it. And I thought that was fascinating because you have both then the ability to express and play through as different types of sexualities, but the gender identities don't really seem to be played with all that much. So I thought that was an interesting game. And I don't know how people have responded to it other than the walkthroughs where I've seen about how you get a kid and how you raise the kid is like, this kid is just given to you based on the characteristics of yourself and your partner could be, any type of relationship, really. So I thought that was an interesting approach to this as well.
Just to add to that, I really liked in Animal Crossing that you don't need to choose a gender, you need to choose the type of hair you want.
But they do have like male and female body shapes, but then the body shape is the same, which I found fascinating. So I'm not really sure why you would choose male or female, boy or girl in Animal Crossing.
They do? That sucks.
Yeah,
this is the one I was playing.
Yeah, New Horizons sort of got rid of that. And so you don't like expressly identify your character as having a specific gender, but like you do have the option to express gender in very gendered ways. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. Like there's also, I mean, if you think about like Cyberpunk 2077, which was supposed to be this groundbreaking experience for playing with gender, they allow you to sort of mix and match expressions, body parts, voices. There's some room for experimentation, and it's still interesting, but like they still limit you in terms of certain expressions. Like there are certain hairstyles that really only go with a masculine body, which is a weird choice. But yeah, like I haven't played Pioneers of Olive Town, but I actually just worked with someone who had a project on that, so that's kind of an interesting overlap there. I think in a lot of ways the games that you see playing with these things really leave it up to the audience to have a queer experience. There's a lot of, especially in video games, there's a lot of hesitation, not so much in indie spaces, but like in the major mainstream game spaces. There's pressure to have representation, but make that representation somehow palatable. And that usually means that the player needs to opt into it. And you have work like pressing the gay button, for example. Like characters are only as gay as your character decides they are. Or like, yeah, relying on players crafting materials. So like you can make your armor pink and have that on a more masculine character. And then there you go, there's your queer gender expression. But it's kind of interesting because like they paint themselves into a corner with this player sexual approach where all of the characters don't really have sexuality until you as the player engage with them, and typically they're always an option. There are exceptions to that. But it's like watching the process of trying to balance ideas of representation and thoughts about how closed off your audience is to representation and how to make those work together.
In Love Island, the game, in the previous season, there was actually, I mean, there are a lot of queer characters that I believe I've been trying to, suss out how queer they are when I'm not queer. So I think they're queer anyway, but it's only kind of, mentioned very much in passing or something. But there's actually a moment where someone asks, oh, do you think those two guys would be cute if they got together? And I'm pretty sure had like the options of yes or no. Of course, they said yes and they got together, but I'm pretty sure that it's just the, heteros, straight protection moment. Like, no, they shouldn't get together, and then they don't. But I that's just my guess.
Well, and it almost sounds like in some ways, those companies producing the media texts, they're also aware of shipping and how fans will be doing this. So it's not even just queer baiting, it's also fan baiting in some ways too. And trying to get fans on board with what you're doing without having to be so explicit with what you're doing.
I don't know if I consider it queer baiting. It maybe needs its own word, because they do provide the queer content, but they also don't. I don't know.
Yeah,
What do
usually
you think?
I just kind of refer to it as an opt-in queer experience. It's there if you want it. It's there if you press the right button. And it's interesting because, like, yeah, sure, it's representation and it's there, but not every player is going to experience it. Like, not everyone is going to press those buttons or opt into that experience to see those storylines. And like, even I'm going to talk about Dragon Age Inquisition again. I've never revealed this part of me in these talks, but I'm obsessed with that game and I write way too much about it. But like, there's a very prominent gay character whose personal story is all about that experience of being gay in a repressed, effectively a repressed country. And it's a pretty impactful story, but you can, as the player, just decide not even to engage with this character. You can kick him out. You don't have to watch his coming out experience and like sort of the fallout of that with his family. And so it's like, how impactful is it if you have that option to just circumvent it completely, I guess is an interesting element of this.
Well, and that's interesting too, because it makes me think of like this current concern in public discourse regarding filter bubbles and echo chambers, and how with social media, you have so much more control over what sources of information you're getting, so that you could potentially just see sources that align with your existing values. You have that choice. You have that choice. You don't have other choices, but yeah. So it almost in some ways is replicating that current, and I wouldn't even say just current, because if you think about even before social media, before the internet and World Wide Web, unless you were physically in proximity to the community, to members of the community, you likely did not have any exposure to that community, especially when you're talking 1980s and earlier, and you're not really seeing that type of representation in a very positive way in more mainstream media. So it is, in some ways, it kind of replicates the sense of people who, don't want to, don't have to engage with those types of representations with members of the LGBTQIA community. Whether that's good, I think, is the big question then.
It's good for us. We can stay away from people who hate us. I mean, it's good for us to experience that echo chamber. It's not what we experience every day.
And there is that idea with the echo chamber that it can provide a safe space, especially for historically oppressed individuals, so that they have the ability to speak and be heard and be recognized. But then it also means that if you're not engaging with a diverse representation of what is out there in objective reality, your subjective reality could be very narrow-minded, leading to things like the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, for example, which I just pulled up an article on because I wanted to see what was going on in terms of Disney World, thinking about Disney World again, and how Disney was against the Don't Say Gay law as it was going into effect. And I wanted to see, well, what did they do during Pride Month? And they still held there, and I really don't know if I like the name of this, the Gay Days at Disney World. So they're holding it. I mean, they are saying it. And they, though, have that economic power to create kind of the Disney World as that bubble, that, echo chamber, the safe space for that discussion to go on. But then you step off of Disney World's grounds, you go into the schools and other places, and it's not the same. And if we have all of these separate bubbles where some people can talk about it and some people cannot talk about it, that's not necessarily healthy for the overall society or country. That was a bit rambling. Sorry for that.
You're absolutely right, in my opinion. It's also even echo chambers have their hierarchy and their bigotry. Like, people who are marginalized within the queer community are only safe from some aspects of the bigotry that they experience every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially with I don't know exactly what's going to happen because of the Supreme Court decision. And I know there are conservatives hoping to use it to roll back protections for same-sex marriage and so forth. But we have seen a lot more attacks against transgender. And there are a lot of laws created or going in place that maybe aren't necessarily aimed at same-sex relationships, but they're definitely aimed at transgender, and seeing that as the way to try to take down the overall queer community. And I don't know where I was going with that. Where was I going with that? That I think is another issue where when you see these different pockets of thought, these echo chambers, they will say things like they're focused on transgender, or they'll code it as pedophilia, for example, and child grooming. That's like why we can't say gay, because that's child grooming. And yet they know enough that there's so much support for LGBTQIA overall that they've learned how to hide or in some ways bigot bait. There's a new term. They're bigot baiting, essentially, with how they're crafting their messages for their particular approach to popular culture, and the popular culture they then create in social media, I guess is where I was going with that.
It's sort of interesting. And I think that's one of the shortcomings of representation in media, and often having these kind of hints and having these potentially opt-in experiences, or segmenting out like, oh, this is queer media, so it's not for people who aren't queer, like that kind of thing. I think that the ability to section off exposure and section off those conversations reinforces these kinds of political things that can happen, because you have large segments of the population that aren't exposed to or aren't aware of LGBTQIA identities, and kind of like realistic contexts of this. And I think that is impactful in really negative ways. Because we see a lot of research on how what you see in media can really paint your opinions of things. It can paint how you perceive things. It can alter sort of your ability to empathize with different groups, depending on how diverse the representation is. And I mean, that goes beyond LGBTQIA issues, and that goes into a lot of other issues of identity and who we're seeing and how we're seeing them. But yeah, like these sort of half steps forward, I don't think in this current cultural moment are helpful for avoiding the political ramifications, if that makes sense.
Dean?
I really love the expression, the bigot baiting, uh, that, that requires a lot of attention, in my opinion. I wonder, in kind of a roundabout way, if they actually think that they are going to harm the LGBT plus community in general. I mean, there is a lot of, there's a lot of racism in the LGBTQ community, and bigots who hate LGBT plus people are also going after Black queer people, trans queer people. I mean, will it actually work to go against the entire LGBT plus community when so much of it doesn't care?
Part of it is interesting, and I don't know. I mean, I think I pay a lot enough attention. I've paid more in the past, but I pay enough attention to social media to find that we're seeing a lot more discussion and rhetoric around this idea of hunting trans people. And there was just a video circulating over the weekend, I believe, and earlier this week, from a trans person in Oklahoma, which, all love to that person, talking about how they were just confronted by a man, saying that the man said he can't wait to, have open hunting season on trans people. And that type of rhetoric is perhaps not, definitely not, I think, in mainstream popular culture, but it is existing in smaller conservative popular culture. And I think that's another instance where if we look at popular cultures as having these different levels themselves between being main and more subcultural, or even subcultures don't exist and we're all just a weird conglomeration of a variety of different cultures. If we're not attending to what's happening in other popular cultures, that could have pretty significant ramifications. Just like how apparently white feminists were surprised that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And we're like, no. A lot of people saw this coming. Maybe you didn't, but that's your echo chamber. You got to get out of it. And if popular cultures, maybe that's my question. Do popular cultures operate as echo chambers?
I think to a degree, yes. Because in a lot of ways, like even if, I guess I'm going back to the opt-in thing, like you choose what you consume in a lot of ways, right? Mm-hmm. And if you know that something isn't aligned with your political beliefs or your personal beliefs, you're probably not going to consume that thing. And then if you see another thing that is like, oh yeah, no, people like me like this thing, so I'm going to go ahead and watch this thing. There's definitely a reinforcement potential there. And I also wanted to say, like, there's also these odd things that happen with like dominant social statuses where you silence enough people or you push enough people out and it becomes just this kind of default assumption that they don't exist in a specific space. And I was mostly thinking about like online interactions, like in online forums and stuff where, everyone's a man, everyone's straight, everyone's white, everyone's from the United States for some reason. And you do have these assumptions sort of built in that you can sort of challenge people on, but even if you do, they revert back to that default assumption. And I think that also, like, just that perception or that tendency to assume identities, especially when it's not necessarily easy to circumvent that or subvert that. I don't think that helps as part of this echo chamber experience or part of this kind of influence experience that can happen with pop culture or social media or whatever else people are dealing with. It's just another layer of problems.
if we look at even something like Archive of Our Own, I love it, but it's definitely promoting specific agendas. I mean, I am very strongly for like content warnings and things like that, but the choice of what content warnings to use and to not use, for example, not warning for racism and all of that discussion, it's creating a very specific culture and people who are going to feel comfortable and people who are not going to feel comfortable in that environment. And I love Archive of Our Own, but it's already changing and it needs to change in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of gets down to, and there's a lot of psychology and sociology and communication theories that essentially come down to this idea that we only know objective reality through our senses, through experience and education. So if we don't have information through experience or education, that then is not objective reality to us. It's our own, how do I like to put this? Yes, we have objective reality. We're all physical. We know that there is something there, but everyone carries around with them their own subjective reality. And maybe that subjective reality overlaps with other people's, but there's so many different ways in which we can have subjective realities. And if you're not aware of LGBTQIA, if all you have is the information on the default, as Christine put it, that essentially means your subjective reality is incomplete. Ooh, look, there goes my arm, is incomplete. And that is potentially a problem when you have nowadays in a very global world and in global popular culture, when you have so many subjective realities butting heads with one another. And I think it then speaks to kind of the flip side of what we've been talking about, because we've been talking about the representation, the communicating out, the speaking about these experiences and identities. But then the flip side in any communication is the listening, it's the receiving. And how do we see that going on right now? I mean, has that improved? Or is that something that we need to be talking more about? It's not just about speaking your experience, it's about listening to others' experiences.
I feel like in specific echo chambers, it's become an issue, like in a good way, to read a book that has representation of a group you're not part of, type of thing. And I really like the trend in YA books these days to have a lot of representation of different groups, so you're likely to read about a group you're not part of and learn something. Maybe learn information, maybe learn emotionally, just like humanize that group or someone from that group. But it's still a pretty specific list of experiences and identities, and it's wonderful that there are more popular ones, but we need more and more intersectionality.
But that is a good point. Sorry, I cut you off, Dean. Go ahead.
No. And in more places, it's only happening in specific places. I just had a librarian tell me that it's this horrible trend and it's, censorship. It's like even wonderful leftist people are not necessarily part of this trend.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point, the fact that, and I think this is where fandoms can come in too. If you have a community, it doesn't necessarily have to be, LGBT community that you're a part of, but just any community you're a part of. If there are people in that community that you trust and they're making these recommendations of, hey, maybe you should check this out, and you create that safe space within your community of trusted fellows, to be able to experience and understand and listen to these other experiences. That's one way where, in a way, echo chambers can actually be rather useful, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think another part of this is, like we were sort of talking about earlier, I'm not sure that everyone has the tools to fully listen when messages are being sent out. Because, you know, as you were saying, that subjective reality, CarrieLynn, like that can also be a limiting factor in terms of what you're perceiving and how you're picking up on things, whether or not you're picking up on things. And then if we're getting into fandom, that comes with all of its its own issues, where there's a lot of like somehow in-group, out-group dynamics happening with fandoms as well. And certain fandoms can actually put people off of pop culture items and materials. Like people grow these associations of fans with specific behaviors or personality traits that they don't like. And so like, oh, I'm not going to watch that thing, or, oh, I'm not going to participate in that thing because I don't like the people who like that thing. Which I guess I'm overcomplicating things, but like there are all of these other elements wrapped up into that experience, and who can actually get at these messages as well, which it's just another level of, okay, so like how do we deal with whether or not you have the media literacy for this kind of thing, for example, or how do we deal with people eschewing a piece of pop culture because of who it's associated with.
Yeah, and again, I come up from all of this as a communication person, and the lack of communication literacy is just sad and frustrating, and I don't know how to address it. And it feels like it should be something that, at least in the United States, we handle starting with like elementary school. We actually have some education about how to listen, not just how to read and write and speak and so forth, but we don't seem to do it as much as we should. And I don't know where else it could start at this point. And with the desires to dismantle public education, it'll be tricky to ensure that that type of exposure is consistent as well. So maybe that brings me to my last question then. We're ending, so this is the end of Pride Month this year. Hopefully we have one next year. I think that's a possibility. We may not, and we need to keep that in mind. But what can popular culture scholars be doing on this issue, on any of the issues that we've discussed here today? What might be some things that you're doing, or some things you would love to be doing, some things you think we could be doing or should be doing on the matter of LGBTQIA identities, communities, and their relationship with popular cultures?
You go.
Okay, sorry. I don't fully know how to answer that. I guess the straightforward answer to that is like public scholarship. Because if pop culture scholars are just keeping things among themselves, or even publishing in inaccessible places, it's not necessarily useful, even if we're finding interesting things or like mentioning places that things can change. So I think the public element is an important part of this. I also think that we find ourselves at a really interesting cultural moment to be having these conversations, because as you pointed out, we have some major political shifts going on. We have a lot of strange legislative things happening. And at the same time, we do have media stories that are not really reflecting the cultural and social realities that we're living in, that are sort of maintaining similar trajectories to the ones that we were on while they were very slow. But I think that there are reasons to be hopeful in representations that we're seeing, but there are also reasons to be apprehensive about trajectories and the current direction of things. So I think it's sort of a multi-pronged approach where you need people who are producing popular culture to be on a specific page and representing specific stories and showing different identities, and the people who study these things to sort of be having these kinds of public conversations and platforms to actually try to reach people with these conversations.
And I want to add to that too. I'm seeing so many people on TikTok in particular saying, "Oh, it's going to be the young people who save us. They're so active and they're so much more open." And I mean, that's, I think, been something progressives in humanity have been saying for a long time, and maybe even conservatives too, who are like, "Oh yeah, our children will save us," but that's not fair. It shouldn't be up to our children and our grandchildren to save us. It should be the adults who are working to make the world a place in which children and grandchildren can flourish. So I would hope that older, more established scholars in popular culture don't think that they don't have to do anything because that's something that the younger and emerging scholars are focusing on. If older and established scholars are not in that conversation and are not ensuring that we have these spaces for this type of work and for this type of public engagement, then we are essentially undercutting what younger scholars would be able to accomplish. And that's the same as if you're a media producer. If you're not helping to create the environment in which those stories can be told and those perspectives and experiences can be shared, it's going to be very hard for younger generations to do so.
Yeah, if I can, I know we're running out of time and I don't want to take up too much, but I just also want to note that there are still a lot of blocks depending on the field that you look at. This is particularly true for some of the fields that I work in, but a lot of the most interesting stuff is happening in people's theses and dissertations, but not really making it to mainstream scholarship. Because you see people working on fan fiction or working on really interesting queer representation stuff, but it's behind this weird wall where it's okay, yeah, you can do that for your dissertation, but you want to do something more serious for your actual scholarship, which I think is another issue that speaks to what you were just talking about, CarrieLynn.
Dean?
The things you said. Also, I think that researching not just leftist fandoms, I think is important. I really appreciate getting to learn about things like QAnon. It helps me just understand a little more, and I think it's important to do more of that. On a smaller kind of scale than the things that you've said, as scholars, we write questionnaires that remember there are more than two genders, that take into account different just lived experiences, that look, not just questionnaires, we make sure our research makes transparent identities not transparent like being white or being straight, and gives room to identities that are being erased and how that interacts with information. Not everybody's white, cis, and so on. Just in things we write, in things we give feedback on, in things we put in edited collections, in people who get whatever travel scholarship things, just the day-to-day of changing that bit by bit of bringing it back into the world where it's so commonly erased.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too, because I think specifically the individuals and the scholars who come from a more purely positivistic quantitative background, they don't have as much training or reflection on just how much their own subjective reality impacts how they measure what they think is objective reality. So I think that's really important to think about too, that. And that again is where I think professors who are training graduate students and undergraduate students, they need to be thinking these things through and making that explicit in the conversations that they're having with scholars and that are upcoming. It also kind of makes me really want to do like so many special issues now for this journal on all of these topics. And I'm like, no, I only publish twice a year. I can't do all the special issues, but yeah, I think there's some really good insights here. And the trick in always is getting people willing to do the work. I just kind of want to leave on maybe a weird note, because my therapist just said yesterday too that, there's the great Martin Luther King Jr. quote about how the history of time bends towards justice. And I know I'm paraphrasing and slandering it, but that kind of assumes that, there's some outside non-human influence that is going to make the world and reality more just over time. And I think we three here may agree, and I know it's probably something that's more common among scholars overall. We know that that's, not as true as the fact that our justice system is based on our actions and how we work together. So it might be that it is these small steps that we have to take. But if enough people are taking small steps, then we do see that bend coming. And right now, you've got a lot of people who weren't paying attention or were very focused on trying to pull that back to the other side. So now, hopefully over the summer, we're going to see that work starting towards the bend towards justice again. But it's going to take all of us doing even the small steps to get there. So maybe that's a hopeful note to end on, but any last reflections before we wrap it up for today? I'm going to take silence as a no, and silence as we're good, and silence as need caffeine.
We can't. I want to say that we can't give up. We need to rest, but we absolutely have to keep being annoying and keep being in danger and put ourselves in danger where other people would be in greater danger. And if we don't, we can't afford to just despair.
And to be there for each other, regardless of the level of danger, to make certain we're there together is the big key there too. Christine, any last thoughts?
I am trying to be as hopeful as I can about those little steps and bending things again. Like I said before, we're at a weird moment where we see sort of things progressing and also things regressing at the same time, and it's like a weird tug of war that's happening culturally and is mostly playing out in the political field, but it's going to be interesting to see if it seeps into things like our media or other sort of subtly influential things that people do. Like watch online spaces, see what people are doing, see what people are talking about, see if there are shifts, because usually you can watch those things. But I everything is kind of in flux right now. Some media is giving me a little bit of hope that we're still inching forward. But yeah, on my end, I think we're going to wait and see what happens over the next year or so. Hoping for the best.
Yeah, fingers crossed for the best. Always wish for the best and prepare for the worst. And on that note, I want to thank you both for being here today. for this conversation. I think there were some really good things that came out of it, and hopefully others will find it useful as well. But more so, I hope you both are definitely, I can't, there we go, heart. Hopefully you're both safe. You'll both be as safe as you wish to be and can be. And same to you and your loved ones and to those around you. Take care. Bye.